There is a power in the Aldrich bloodline that has no name in any living language. The pack elders call it the ancient fury. They say it is why the first Alpha King could tear mountains apart with his hands, why the second burned a forest to ash without touching a flame. They say it is also why the third king went mad before his 30th year. Every king since has spent his reign learning to keep it quiet. Zaid learned younger than any of them. He was 8 years old the first time he felt it, a white-hot pressure behind his sternum, a sound like the world splitting, and he locked it down with every ounce of will he had. He has been locking it down ever since. He is 26 now, the most controlled king his line has ever produced. His court calls him iron. His enemies call him ice. Only one person in the world has ever seen past both. Her name is Marin. She is his fated mate, his anchor, the single reason the cage holds. He would burn the world to keep her safe. He doesn't realize yet that burning the world is exactly what's coming. Chapter 1. The court learned early not to stare at the Alpha King. Not because he forbade it. He never had to. There was simply something in the way Zaid moved through a room, measured, unhurried. Each step placed with the quiet certainty of a man who had never once doubted where he was allowed to stand, that made prolonged eye contact feel like pressing your palm against a hot iron. You could do it. You just understood, instinctively, that you would regret it. Lords inclined their heads as he passed. Ladies stilled. Conversations died at the edges of the room, and were reborn only after he'd moved beyond earshot. He wore the crown the way other men wore old scars, like something that had become so much a part of him that he'd stopped noticing its weight. He noticed everything else. The steward who had been skimming grain taxes for 2 seasons. The Alliance Lord whose handshake ran 3 seconds too long, calculating, not cordial. The Eastern emissary watching the door instead of the king, which meant he was waiting for someone, which meant tonight's negotiations were already compromised. Zaid catalogued all of it behind a face that gave away precisely nothing. "You look like a statue," Marin had told him once, early in their courtship, standing on her toes to study him during a state dinner. A very expensive, very intimidating statue. Is that a complaint? She'd considered it with the particular gravity she gave to small questions. No, she'd decided. Statues are useful. They make people feel the right size. He hadn't been able to argue with that. She was across the hall now, standing near the tall windows where the winter light came in pale and clean, deep in conversation with the Healers Guild representative. Her dark hair was pinned up tonight, a few strands escaping at her temple the way they always did by the second hour of any formal event. She'd stopped fighting it. He'd stopped pretending he didn't find it distracting. He wasn't watching her. He was simply aware of her the way you are aware of the only source of warmth in a cold room, not because you're looking at it, but because your body orients toward it without instruction. That was the bond. That was what it felt like from the inside. Not fire, not thunder, nothing as dramatic as the old songs promised. It felt like gravity. Quiet, constant, and absolutely non-negotiable. As if she felt the shift in his attention, Marin glanced up. Their eyes met across 30 feet of polished marble and candlelight. She didn't smile. She rarely performed her emotions for rooms full of people, but something in her expression settled, the way a flame stops flickering when the draft is gone. He looked away first, returned his attention to the Eastern emissary. But the pressure behind his sternum eased, and the thing he kept locked in the deep architecture of himself went quiet, and he could think again. He heard Zane before he saw him. The laugh was his own laugh, same pitch, same cadence, the timing perfectly calibrated to be charming. Zaid had never found his own laugh charming. He turned. His twin stood at the far end of the reception gallery, surrounded by a cluster of minor nobility, holding a wine glass with the easy elegance of a man who had been practicing looking comfortable his entire life. And he had been. Zaid knew that better than anyone. Zane was identical to him in every external measurement. Same height, same dark hair, same jaw, same hands. The crown was the only difference, and in civilian clothes at a court function, even that distinction disappeared. Courtiers who didn't know them well had been making the mistake for 26 years. Some of them never stopped. Zane was saying something that made the group around him laugh, and he turned slightly with the movement of the conversation, and his eyes across the room, over the heads of a dozen irrelevant people, found Zaid's. He smiled. It was a perfect smile. It reached his eyes and everything. Zaid had watched his twin practice that smile in mirrors when they were boys, adjusting it until it looked spontaneous. He'd never said anything. He wasn't sure why, something that felt, even then, like mercy. He inclined his head slightly. Zane inclined his back, a mirror image, and returned to his conversation. Zaid watched him for 3 seconds longer than was necessary. Something was different. He couldn't name it, couldn't locate it in any specific gesture or word or expression. It was more like a frequency, a note running just slightly below the range of conscious hearing, felt in the chest rather than the ear. Zane had always carried a particular kind of stillness beneath his performances. The stillness of a man who had decided something and was waiting for the right moment to act on it. Tonight that stillness was gone. Tonight there was something else in its place, something that moved. "You're doing it again," said Marin's voice at his shoulder. He hadn't heard her approach. She was the only person in the world who could do that. Doing what? Watching him like he's a problem you're about to solve. She came to stand beside him, close enough that her arm brushed his. Not enough contact to be remarked upon. Exactly enough to anchor him. Is he? Zaid considered the question honestly, the way he did everything when she asked it. "I don't know," he said. Marin followed his gaze across the room, to where Zane was laughing again at something a lord had said, perfectly warm, perfectly present, perfectly himself. She was quiet for a moment. "That's not like you," she said finally. "No, it wasn't." "Go back to your conversation," he said quietly. "I'm fine." She didn't argue, but she let her hand brush his brief, deliberate before she moved away. Across the room, Zane refilled his wine and did not look at the king again. He didn't need to. Chapter 2. The thing about being a twin was that the world never let you forget which one you were. Not cruelly. That was the part Zane had spent years trying to explain to himself, in the dark, in the quiet hours when the court was asleep and he was not. It was never cruel. Cruelty would have been easier. Cruelty you could point to, name, build a justified anger around. You could take cruelty to a mirror and say, "This is what was done to me, and this is why I am the way I am." What he had instead was something softer and more total. 1,000 small, polite reminders, delivered without malice, by people who genuinely meant well, and would have been baffled to learn they'd caused any harm at all. The Crown Prince and his brother, His Majesty and the Spare. Zaid and Zane, yes, of course, wonderful to see you too. The "two" was always the worst part, that small, trailing syllable that meant also, additionally. In the same category but secondary to the primary entry. He had heard it his entire life, appended to his name like a footnote, and he had smiled each time with the same practiced warmth he'd built over decades of needing to seem like none of it landed. It all landed, every time. He had simply become very good at not showing where. He had Zaid's face. He knew it. Mirrors had been clarifying on this point since childhood, since the first time he'd stood beside his brother and understood, with the particular clarity of a young child processing an unfair thing, that the universe had given them identical materials and then distributed entirely different fates. Same jaw, same brow, same dark hair that fell the same way when he didn't bother to push it back. He had his brother's voice, his brother's hands, his brother's blood running through him in identical measure. What he did not have was a single room in any building in the kingdom that was his. Every space he occupied by permission. Every title he held existed in relation to someone else's. The king's brother, the spare prince, the secondary heir. He was defined, always and entirely, by his proximity to a man who had been born 4 minutes before him and had been leaving him behind ever since. Not intentionally. That was the other thing he had spent years trying to hold on to, turning it over in his hands like evidence he kept hoping would say something different. Zaid had never left him behind on purpose. Zaid had simply been first, and firstness had its own gravity, and everything else arranged itself around it whether it meant to or not. He did not hate his brother. That was the truth he returned to most often, running his thumb over it like a worry stone worn smooth. He did not hate Zaid. Hate required a heat he'd never quite managed to sustain. It flared sometimes, in the worst moments, but it always burned down to something colder before it could become anything useful. What he felt instead was more precise and more persistent than hate. The accumulated weight of a life in which he had never once been first. Never chosen. Never necessary. Only contingent. In case. He was 26 years old, and he had been in case for every single day of it. In case Zaid failed. In case Zaid died. In case the primary heir became unavailable, for any of the 1,000 reasons primary heirs became unavailable throughout history. He had been prepared and positioned and maintained like a spare part kept in good condition, kept informed, kept ready for a moment that everyone quietly assumed would never come. He had spent 26 years being ready for something no one expected him to ever have to do. He had spent 26 years waiting. The elder found him on a Thursday, which Zane would later think was appropriate. Nothing significant ever happened on a Thursday. It was a day designed to be forgotten the middle of the week's middle, the calendar's least distinguished entry, the kind of day that passed without record and left no impression on the people who lived through it. He was in the lower library, not the grand one, with the vaulted ceilings and the portrait of his father watching from the east wall, with that particular painted expression that managed to convey pride and expectation simultaneously, as though even in oil on canvas, the man had been unable to simply exist without communicating his requirements. The small library, the one at the end of the east corridor that smelled like damp stone and old binding glue, and the particular staleness of books that hadn't been opened in years. There was nothing in it worth impressing people, with no rare texts, no gilded spines, no volumes that signaled sophistication to anyone who happened to observe you reading them. He came here when he needed to think. Nobody had ever noticed. In 26 years of living in this palace, not a single person had ever followed him here or asked him where he'd been. That too was information. The elder's name was Corvain. He had been stripped of his council seat 14 months ago, a procurement scandal, the official record said, filed and closed with the efficiency of an institution that preferred its embarrassments contained. Zane had always suspected the procurement scandal was a pretext for something more ideological. Corvain had made no secret of his position on the Ancient Fury throughout his tenure on the council. He believed it disqualified Zaid from the throne entirely, had argued it in formal session twice, had been overruled twice, and had apparently decided that formal channels had exhausted their usefulness. He sat down across from Zane without being invited, without announcing himself, with the settled ease of a man arriving at a destination he had been traveling toward for a long time. He placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on the table between them and folded his hands over it once before moving them aside, as though presenting something, and then deliberately stepping back to let it speak for itself. Zane looked at it, did not touch it. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "Probably not," Corvain agreed pleasantly. The pleasantness was its own kind of unsettling the tone of a man who had already accounted for every version of this conversation and found none of them threatening. "If anyone sees you speaking with me, no one will." The elder folded his hands on the table with the patience of a man who had been waiting for this specific conversation for considerably longer than Zane had been sitting in this specific library. "I've been careful. I've also been watching you, Lord Zane, for considerably longer than you'd be comfortable knowing." Zane said nothing. It was a technique he'd absorbed from his brother without meaning to, through proximity and observation over 2.5 decades. Silence as a tool, not a void. Not the silence of someone who had nothing to say, but the silence of someone who understood that the person across from them would fill it, and that what they chose to fill it with was always more useful than whatever you might have said instead. Corvain filled it. "There is a ritual," he said. Older than the current bloodline. Older than the palace. Possibly the texts I found it in were not dated, which usually means the people who wrote them didn't think longevity was going to be a concern. A pause. "It requires a solar eclipse, a true one, totality, when the Alpha King's power reaches its lowest natural point. The astronomical records confirm 1 in 43 days. He nodded toward the cloth-wrapped object. "And this, a blood component, yours specifically. What does it do?" "It masks your scent. Completely. For the duration of the eclipse." The library was very quiet. Outside, somewhere distant in the palace, a door closed. A normal sound. The sound of a building continuing to exist while something irreversible was being laid on a table in one of its smallest rooms. "You have his face already," Corvain continued, his voice taking on the reasonable, almost gentle quality of someone walking a companion through a logical sequence they've already completed themselves. His voice, his hands, with the scent masked, there would be no difference any living creature could detect. Not a guard, not a wolf, not— he let the implication complete itself. Not her. Zane looked at the cloth-wrapped object on the table. He understood what was being offered. He understood it fully, immediately, with the particular clarity of a man who had been, on some level, waiting for someone to say it out loud, not because he had planned for it, not because he had been moving toward it, but because the shape of it was familiar. Because some part of him had always known that the only power he had that his brother didn't was this: the face, the voice, the perfect, accidental replica of the one thing the kingdom couldn't function without. He had never let himself think it through completely before. He had always stopped at the edge of it. He did not pick up the object. "Leave," he said. Corvain left. He left the object on the table, which both of them understood was not an oversight. Zane sat with it for a long time. The library did what it always did, held its silence, offered no opinion, smelled like old paper and damp stone, and the accumulated indifference of a room that had never been important enough to renovate. He sat across from the cloth-wrapped object, and did not touch it, and thought. He thought about Marin not with desire, which would have been a simpler thing to identify and dismiss. He thought about the way she looked at Zaid in crowded rooms, that private settling, that involuntary orientation toward him, the small and total way her whole body acknowledged his presence before her face did. He had watched it for 2 years, from whatever peripheral position the evening seating arrangements had assigned him. He had catalogued every instance with the careful detachment of a man studying something he had accepted, rationally and completely, that he would never be permitted to touch. He thought about the bond, what it did, what it meant in practical terms, not the poetry of it, the songs and the old language, but the structural reality. The bond was the cage. The bond was the thing that kept the ancient fury from consuming Zaid from the inside out. The thing that made him stable, fit to rule, safe to be near. He thought about what happened to that cage if someone else placed a mark first. He thought about what happened to the most controlled man in the kingdom when the one thing that had always held him together was corrupted. He thought about what happened to a king without his anchor. He unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a vial of dark glass, something moving within it that was not quite liquid and not quite light, catching the dim lamp glow with a quality that suggested it had its own agenda. Beneath the vial, a folded piece of paper. Dates, times, astronomical coordinates for the next total eclipse, written in Corvain's precise, unhurried hand. 43 days away. He read the instructions once, all the way through, without stopping. Set the paper down. Looked at the vial for a long time, with the expression of a man doing mathematics at a remove from his own emotions. Not excited, not horrified. Simply working through the problem with the thoroughness it had always deserved and had never, until now, been given. He was not a monster. He knew that. He believed it with the same steady conviction he brought to other established facts about himself. His height, his blood type, the year of his birth. He was not a monster. He was a man who had been told his entire life, in 1,000 small and polite and entirely well-meaning ways, that he did not matter. And he had finally, quietly, carefully, after 26 years of sitting with that information, decided to disagree. He picked up the vial, wrapped it back in the cloth with the same care Corvain had used, the same deliberateness, as though the object deserved to be handled properly. Put it in his pocket. Stood, pushed the chair back. Looked once at the empty table, where the cloth-wrapped object had been, and then did not look again. And went to dinner. Chapter 3. The sky had been dimming for an hour before anyone thought to remark on it. Marin noticed first. She always noticed atmospheric things, the quality of light, the way sound traveled differently before a storm. She had been standing in the inner courtyard, watching the color drain from the afternoon, in slow, incremental degrees, the blue going gray, the gray going silver, the shadows flattening against the stone until the world looked like a painting left out in the rain. The eclipse was not a secret. The astronomers had announced it 3 weeks prior. A celestial event of moderate significance, the official memo had read, totality lasting approximately 4 to 5 minutes, viewing recommended from elevated positions. She had meant to watch it from the eastern tower with Zaid. Instead, a guard had pulled him aside 20 minutes ago, something about the northern border, riders incoming, an alert that couldn't wait, and he'd pressed a brief kiss to her temple, and said he'd find her after, and she'd said, of course. And now she was alone in the courtyard, with the sky going dark above her, and the torches guttering in a wind that felt wrong for the season. She didn't mind. She tipped her head back and watched the shadow swallow the last edge of light. Totality. The world went the color of deep water. The torches steadied. Somewhere above the palace walls, the first stars appeared, confused into existence by the false dark, blinking open like eyes. It was beautiful. She was still looking up when she heard his footsteps. She knew his walk. She had catalogued it without meaning to over 2 years of proximity, the particular rhythm of it, unhurried but purposeful, each step placed with that quality she'd once described to him as certainty. She'd teased him about it. He'd looked faintly puzzled, as though the concept of walking uncertainly had never occurred to him as an option. She smiled before she turned around. I thought you had a border crisis, she said. It resolved. His voice. Exactly his voice. He crossed the courtyard toward her, hands loose at his sides, dark hair catching the strange silver light of the eclipse. She watched him come and felt the familiar gravity of him, that pull, that bone-deep orientation her body performed without instruction whenever he was near. Everything felt right. That was the part she would return to, later, when she was trying to understand. Not the wrongness, the rightness. How completely, seamlessly, catastrophically right it felt. He reached her. His hand came up to her face, thumb brushing her cheekbone, and she leaned into it the way she always did. It's beautiful, she said, meaning the eclipse. Yes, he said, not looking at the sky. She laughed softly. You're not even looking. I know what I'd rather look at. She met his eyes, and something so small, so fast she nearly missed it entirely, moved through her. Not alarm, not recognition, something quieter. A single note of discord in a chord that was otherwise perfect. His eyes. She blinked. They were the same. Of course they were the same. She was being foolish. She started to speak. His hands moved to her shoulders, turning her gently, almost tenderly, and she let him because there was no reason not to, because this was Zaid, because everything about this was Zaid. And she was still turning when she felt his mouth at her shoulder, at the curve where her neck met her collarbone, where the neck of her dress had slipped, and she thought, this is... The pain arrived before the thought could finish. Not sharp, that was the worst of it, not a clean pain she could flinch away from. It was cold, spreading from that one point outward, moving through her like ink dropped in water, reaching into the pathways of the bond, and finding them, and pulling. Something ancient and structural inside her screamed that this was wrong, that this was violation, that something was being written on her that had no right to be written. She wrenched away with a sound she didn't recognize as hers. What? She looked at him. He was watching her with an expression that was almost apologetic. Almost. The way you are apologetic about something you did deliberately. The discord she'd felt 30 seconds ago rushed back, amplified, deafening. His eyes. The color had been right. The temperature had not. Zaid's eyes, when they rested on her, always felt like the moment a fire catches warm, intent, consuming. These eyes were watching her with something that was colder, more calculating. The eyes of someone who had been performing warmth rather than feeling it. Zane, she whispered. He said nothing. She looked down at her shoulder. Through the torn edge of her dress, the mark glowed violet black, wrong in the way only something corrupted could be wrong, pulsing with a cold light that her body rejected even as it was absorbed. The eclipse ended. The sun came back, and the courtyard gates opened. He stood in the archway, crown absent, dark coat, dark eyes, the face that matched the one across the courtyard from her except the temperature was right, and she knew it instantly. And the relief that flooded through her was so enormous it nearly took her legs. Zaid. He wasn't looking at her yet. He was looking at his brother. 3 seconds. She counted them without meaning to. Standing in the returning sunlight with cold fire burning at her shoulder, watching the Alpha King process what his eyes were telling him. 1. His hands opened at his sides. 2. The gold crept into his irises, not warm. Nothing like warm. 3. The palace gates came off their hinges with a sound like the world being torn in half. And Zane ran. Chapter 4. The gates didn't fall cleanly. That was the detail that stayed with everyone afterward, not that it happened, but how. A clean destruction would have been easier to process. An explosion, a shockwave, something that followed the logic of force and physics. Instead, the iron simply gave, the way metal gives when it has been subjected to a pressure it was never designed to resist. The hinges tore from the stone, mounting like thread pulled from cloth. Both gates, each one 2 inches of solid iron, each one requiring 4 men to open or close, swung wide and hit the courtyard walls. And the sound they made was the sound of something final. Then silence. Zaid stood in the archway where the gates had been, his back to the courtyard, facing the direction his brother had run. His hands were at his sides. He wasn't breathing hard. He wasn't shaking. That was the first thing Maren noticed when her mind started working again, that he was still. The stillness he always carried had not left him. It had simply changed in quality, the way water changes when it freezes. Same substance, different state, and considerably more dangerous. She took a step toward him. The guard beside her, Davan, the captain of the inner watch, a man who had served the palace for 15 years without once visibly losing his composure, put his arm out. Not blocking her, just present. A quiet, physical suggestion that she wait. She waited. Zaid turned around. The courtyard was crowded now. Word traveled fast in a palace. In under 2 minutes, every guard on the inner rotation had converged on the sound of impact, and behind them a spreading cluster of servants and courtiers, pressed into the archways and doorways, like water finding cracks. Drawn by the catastrophic noise, and held by something they couldn't name, but could feel a change in atmospheric pressure, a charge in the air, the particular quality of danger that preceded events that would be spoken about for decades. They all went still when he turned. Not because he told them to, not because of the crown, which he wasn't wearing, or the title, which he hadn't invoked. Because of what was in his face. His eyes had gone gold. Not the warm amber gold of the portraits, not the deep honey color that appeared when he was tired, or content, or close to laughing. This was the gold of a forge at maximum heat, bright, sourceless, casting a faint illumination on the planes of his face that had no business being there. It should have looked wrong. It looked inevitable, the way a thing looks when it has finally arrived after years of being delayed. His expression was composed. That was the most frightening thing. The gates were in pieces on the ground, and his face was perfectly, precisely composed, every feature controlled, every line deliberate, the architecture of a man who was not losing himself but finding something, and what he was finding was larger and older and more absolute than anything the watching crowd had encountered before. He moved through the courtyard and people parted for him without being asked. Not out of respect, out of instinct. The same instinct that makes small animals press flat against the ground when a shadow passes over them from above. He walked like a different gravity applied to him now. Unhurried, but with a directness that made the air feel compressed, each step landing with a weight that seemed disproportionate to the physical reality of it. A lord near the eastern doorway took 3 involuntary steps backward and didn't appear to notice he'd done it. Zaid stopped in front of Maren. She had not moved from where Davan held position beside her. Her shoulder burned with a cold that had nothing to do with temperature. She could feel the false mark pulsing against her skin like a second heartbeat, irregular and invasive, and she hated it with a clarity that surprised her. She looked up at him. This close, the gold of his eyes was extraordinary, luminous, layered, something moving in the depth of them that she had no word for. She had spent 2 years learning every version of this face. She had seen him furious, exhausted, amused, grief-stricken, stripped of every professional defense in the private dark of their chambers. She had never seen this. And yet, underneath it, underneath all of it, underneath the burning gold and the unearthly stillness and the gates destroyed at the edge of her peripheral vision, she could still find him. The same way you can find the structure of a building even when it's on fire. The bones of him were unchanged. The intelligence, the precision, the love that he carried like a classified document, shared only in controlled conditions. It was still there. All of it was still there. His hand came up, slowly, deliberately. The way you move around something that has been frightened, not to startle it further. His fingers touched her jaw, the lightest contact, a question rather than a claim, and she turned her face into his palm and felt him exhale. One breath, the only concession his body made. His thumb moved once across her cheekbone, memorizing or confirming. She wasn't sure which. Then he straightened. He looked at Devon. She doesn't leave the inner ward. His voice had dropped below its usual register, not louder, but denser, carrying in a way that bypassed the ear and arrived somewhere lower in the chest. No one enters her chambers without your direct clearance. No one who shares my face. Devon, who had served through 2 reigns and 3 succession crises without losing his composure, swallowed visibly. Yes, Your Majesty. Zaid looked at Marin again. 4 words. Quiet, absolute. Carrying the weight of a promise made at a frequency the bond recognized before her mind did. I will come back. She nodded once. His hand fell away from her face. He walked through the ruined gateway and into the snow beyond, alone, without armor, without guards, without anything except the ancient fury burning gold in his eyes, and the certainty of a predator who has identified his target and has no intention of losing the trail. The palace held its breath. In the archway where the gates had been, snow drifted through the gap and settled on the courtyard stones, and no one moved to follow him, and no one spoke, and the silence stretched long and total and cold. Somewhere beyond the walls, in the white dark of the winter forest, a wolf that was also a king began to run, and the world got out of his way. Chapter 5. The healer's name was Senna, and she had the particular composure of someone who had delivered bad news so many times that she had stopped softening it. Marin had always respected that about her. She respected it considerably less now. The examination took place in Marin's chambers. The fire built high, every lamp lit. Devon posted outside the closed door, with instructions to admit no one. Senna worked in silence for a long time, circling the mark, not touching it, studying it with the focused attention of a scholar encountering a text in a language she recognized but had hoped never to read. The mark had settled overnight into something more defined. In the first hours after the courtyard, it had been raw, irregular, pulsing with that cold violet light. Now it sat at the curve of Marin's shoulder in precise, deliberate lines, a pattern that wasn't quite a symbol and wasn't quite a wound, something between a brand and a bruise. Its edges clean in a way that felt worse than messiness would have. It looked intentional. Because it was. Marin sat straight and kept her breathing even and watched Senna's face for information, which was how she'd always read rooms, not listening for what people said but watching for what their bodies did when they thought no one was paying attention. Senna's hands stilled over the mark. That was the first thing. Tell me, Marin said. Senna looked up. No preamble. A false claim mark begins to integrate within a lunar cycle, if left unchallenged. Integration means it stops sitting on the surface of the bond and starts rewriting the interior structure of it. The pathways that carry the true mate bond, the channels that were formed between you and the king, begin to reroute, redirect. Redirect toward Zane. Toward whoever placed the mark. Yes. Marin processed this the way she processed most difficult information quietly, completely, without the luxury of looking away from it. And if it fully integrates, the true bond doesn't disappear. Senna chose her words with the precision of someone navigating a field she had studied only in texts and hoped to never encounter in practice. But it becomes inaccessible, buried under the false structure, like building a wall through the center of a room. The room still exists. You simply can no longer reach what's on the other side. The fire crackled. Snow pressed against the window panes. Marin looked at the mark on her shoulder and thought, very clearly and very calmly, I will not let that happen. How long do I have? 26 days. Perhaps 28, given the strength of the original bond. The stronger the true bond, the longer it resists. 26 days. Zaid had been gone for 1. And to stop it, Marin said, to overwrite it, he places his true mark. It isn't that simple. Senna sat down across from her, which meant the part she'd been delaying had arrived. Under normal circumstances, a mate mark is placed instinctively. The bond guides it. The alpha doesn't have to think about it. The biology does the work. She paused. But the false mark has corrupted the pathway. The bond can no longer guide the process automatically. For the true mark to overwrite what Zane placed, it has to be placed consciously, deliberately, with complete awareness of every channel it's working through. Marin waited. That level of precision requires the ancient fury to be present, Senna said. Not suppressed, not caged. Fully present and fully controlled at the same time. The fury isn't just destructive force, it's also the deepest biological expression of the mate bond in the Aldrich line. It's the part of the king that is entirely, irrevocably oriented toward you. To place the true mark over a corrupted pathway, he needs access to all of that. He needs to be able to hold it consciously and direct it. She let that land. He has spent his entire life, Marin said slowly, making sure that never happens. Yes. He has never once allowed the fury and his conscious mind to occupy the same space at the same time. To my knowledge, no Alpha King in the last 4 generations has. The fire popped. Somewhere outside, wind moved through the ruined gateway and made a sound like breathing. Marin thought about the courtyard, about the gold in his eyes, that burning, sourceless, extraordinary gold, and the way his face had stayed composed, even as the gates came apart in his hands. She thought about his thumb on her cheekbone. 4 words, quiet and absolute. She thought about what it had cost him to walk away from her and into the snow, carrying all of that, alone. If he comes back with the fury still burning, she said, and he tries to place the mark while he's still in that state, not integrated, just present. The mark would take hold, Senna said. But the process would be destabilizing, for both of you. And the fury, once fully expressed without integration, has historically, she stopped. Historically what? A pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. Not receded. In the historical record, Alpha Kings, who fully expressed the ancient fury without integration, did not recover their previous equilibrium. The fury becomes the dominant state. He stops being a king. He stops being the man you know. The room was very quiet. Marin stood up, crossed to the window. The snow outside was deep and still, the forest beyond the palace walls dark and impenetrable. He was out there somewhere in all of that, burning gold in the dark, hunting with the precision of something that had stopped pretending it was only human. She pressed her fingers lightly to the mark on her shoulder and felt it pulse cold, invasive, wrong, and made herself feel the full wrongness of it without flinching away. Then she made herself think about what Senna had said. The only way to save the bond was for Zaid to hold the fury consciously, to stand in the full force of everything he'd spent his life suppressing, and to be present inside it, rather than destroyed by it. And the only way that happened, the only precedent in 26 years of knowing him, was if she was in front of him. She was his anchor. She always had been. The cage had never been the point. She was. If I went to him, Marin said, still looking at the snow, before he reaches Zane. If I could get to him while the fury is still, you would be walking toward something extraordinarily dangerous, Senna said quietly. I know. He may not recognize. He will recognize me. She said it without heat. Simply. The certainty of someone stating a fact they have tested and found to hold. He always recognizes me. Senna was silent for a long moment. 26 days, she said finally. Marin turned from the window. Then I have 25, she said, to find him first. Chapter 6. They met at dawn, which told her everything. The council chamber was on the east wing's 2nd floor, a room Marin had attended exactly 4 times as an observer, seated to the left of Zaid's chair, present but not participating, learning the architecture of power by watching how it moved. She knew its location. She knew its protocols. She knew that a full council convening before the morning meal, without the king's summons, without his chair occupied, was not a scheduled function. It was a maneuver. She found out from a kitchen servant, a girl named Petra, who had the particular gift of moving through corridors invisibly and who had brought Marin her tea every morning for 8 months without once being asked to stop. Petra set the cup down, hesitated at the door, and said quietly, without looking up, "The Lord Steward called them an hour ago, my lady. All 7. The East Chamber." Marin was already dressed. She didn't rush. Rushing would have been the wrong signal to herself, to anyone watching. She walked the corridor to the east wing at the pace of a woman who had been invited. The mark burned at her shoulder. It had been burning since the courtyard, a low, cold pulse that she had spent the night learning to wall off from the rest of her awareness, the way you wall off a persistent sound, not ignoring it, exactly, but refusing to let it set the rhythm of her breathing. She wore a high-necked dress, not to hide it, to make them work harder to look at it if they wanted to. She pushed open the chamber door without knocking. 7 faces turned toward her. The Lord Steward stood at the head of the long table, a tall man, silver-haired, with the particular bearing of someone who had been the most important person in most rooms for so long that he had stopped checking whether it was still true. His name was Aldrich Voss, which was a coincidence of surname that he had leveraged for 30 years to imply a closeness to the royal line that wasn't documented anywhere. He had built his entire career on the architecture of implication. He recovered from her entrance in under 2 seconds. "Lady Marin, this is a closed council session. You were not summoned," she said. "I'm aware." She crossed to the table, did not sit. Standing while they sat was a calculation, not a preference. Neither was the king, and yet here you are. A beat of silence. Voss's expression arranged itself into something that was meant to read as concern. "Given the events of yesterday, the council has a responsibility to assess what the king is capable of," Marin said. "Yes, I understood the agenda from the hallway." She let that land. "The Alpha King destroyed palace property," said Elder Cora from the left side of the table, a woman who had always struck Marin as someone who had chosen a side early in life and stopped questioning it. "In a loss of control that endangered every person in the inner ward. The ancient fury, once expressed at that level because his mate was violated," Marin said. Her voice was even. She had made it even deliberately, on the walk here, breathing it flat and steady until the anger underneath it became something she could aim rather than something that aimed her. His mate was deceived, marked without consent by a man using a ritual that required specialized knowledge to execute. She looked at Voss. Specialized, restricted knowledge, the kind that doesn't circulate in common libraries. Something moved behind Voss's eyes, fast, gone before it fully arrived. She filed it. "The king's response," she continued, "was proportionate to the provocation. He destroyed property. He harmed no one. He secured his mate's safety, issued clear protective orders, and removed himself from the palace to pursue the individual responsible." She paused. "That is not a king losing control. That is a king choosing which threat to prioritize." The fury, once released at that magnitude, Cora began again. "Is not your area of expertise," Marin said, "nor mine, which is why I spent the night with the pack healer rather than convening a meeting I had no authority to call." The room was very still. Elder Dane, the oldest at the table and the one who had, in Marin's observation, the most genuine investment in institutional integrity rather than political outcome, cleared his throat. "Lady Marin, whatever the provocation, the question of succession protocol in the event of—" "There is no event," Marin said. "The king is alive. He is not incapacitated. He is not abdicating. He is hunting a traitor who used a forbidden ritual to attack the crown through his mate bond." She placed both hands flat on the table. "I want to be very precise about the sequence here. The king was attacked first. Everything that followed is a consequence of that attack. If this council moves on succession protocol while the king is in the field responding to an act of treason, that sequence will be documented. All of it, including who called this meeting, and when, and who was present, and what was said." Silence. Not the silence of a room considering an argument. The silence of a room that has understood a threat and is deciding how to receive it. Voss's expression had not changed. That was interesting. Most of the other faces had shifted discomfort, recalibration, the subtle physical tells of people who were reassessing. Voss looked exactly as he had when she walked in. She noted that too. "The king will return," Marin said. She straightened, removed her hands from the table. "When he does, this council will be in its proper function. Until then, this room is closed." She looked at Dane. "I'm asking for 3 days before any formal protocol proceedings are opened. As his mate, as the person with the most direct knowledge of the situation." She did not phrase it as a request. Dane looked at her for a long moment, reading her the way experienced men read rooms, checking load-bearing walls. Then he nodded, once. 3 days, he said. She held eye contact with Voss for exactly 2 seconds. He smiled at her, smooth and practiced. She turned and walked out. In the corridor, alone, she let herself lean against the wall for 3 breaths. The mark pulsed cold at her shoulder. Her hands were shaking, had been shaking since she pushed open the door, though she'd held them still by force. She pushed off the wall. 24 days remaining. She had a king to find. Chapter 7. The first territory fell away beneath him like a dream. Pine forest, frozen ground, the snow reading like a text he had always known how to translate. A broken branch at shoulder height, Zane moving fast, not carefully, burning energy he didn't have. A disturbed patch of snowfall beneath a low overhang where he'd stopped briefly, probably to catch his breath, probably to listen for pursuit. He'd been listening for the wrong thing. Zaid didn't make noise when he moved now. He wasn't sure when that had changed. Somewhere between the courtyard and the tree line, the body had made its own adjustments, weight redistributed, heel strike eliminated, each footfall placed with a precision that was no longer conscious. The snow accepted him without protest. The forest didn't announce him. He was aware of this the way you are aware of your own heartbeat, not constantly, only when you check. And when you checked, the information was simply there, neutral and factual. He was also aware that he was not cold. He should have been. He had left without a coat, without armor, without anything except the clothes he'd been wearing when he walked into the courtyard and found the mark on Marin's shoulder. The temperature had dropped through the night to the kind of cold that damaged tissue. He registered it the way he registered the bark texture of the trees he passed present, noted, irrelevant. The fury ran through him like a current through wire, constant, neither building nor diminishing, just there, fully present, fully awake, patient in the way that deep things are patient. He followed the trail north. First territory, second territory. Zane was fast. He'd always been fast. They shared a bloodline that made both of them faster than anything they'd grown up beside. But fast and efficient were not the same thing, and fear, Zaid had learned young, was the most expensive thing a body could run on. His brother was burning. He could read it in the lengthening stride pattern, the increasing distance between each rest point. Could read the desperation compounding in the trail's geometry north, then northeast, then a cut west that was overcorrection. The movement of someone who had lost confidence in their direction and was hoping a change of heading would feel like a plan. Zaid corrected for the overcorrection, cut through a valley rather than around it, emerged on the far side of the ridge in time to catch, at the very edge of the tree line, a dark figure moving through the white. He stopped. Watched. Zane stopped too, had felt, somehow, the weight of being seen. They looked at each other across 200 meters of open snow. Then Zane ran again. Zaid followed. Second territory. Third. Zane tried the first time at a frozen river crossing, stood on the far bank, while Zaid came through the trees, and held both hands out, empty, the universal language of weight. Brother. The word landed. Zaid stopped walking. Not because the word moved him, because stopping was information. What his brother did with the space would tell him something. I know you can hear me. Zane's voice was controlled, but the breath that carried it was ragged. I know you're still in there. Zaid said nothing. What I did, Zane started. Don't, Zaid said. His own voice surprised him. It came out lower than it should have, resonant in a way that carried across the frozen water without being raised, and Zane flinched at the sound of it, the way you flinch at something you feel before you hear. I just need you to run, Zaid said. Or don't, but stop talking. Zane ran. Third territory. Fourth. The landscape changed. The dense pine forest gave way to older growth oak and ash, massive trunks, the snow thinner here under the canopy cover. The trail was harder to read, but it didn't matter. He'd moved beyond reading the trail an hour ago. He could feel the direction now, a pull at the base of his sternum that operated on a frequency older than tracking skill or wolven instinct. The Fury knew where his brother was. The Fury had always known. It was simply that it had never been allowed to say so. He was close when Zane tried the second time. A clearing, circular, the trees ringing it like witnesses. Zane was standing in the center of it, not running, not positioned defensively, just standing. The posture of a man who had calculated his options and found them insufficient and decided, finally, on something different. Zaid walked into the clearing and stopped. Zane looked at him. The identical face, his own features rearranged into something that was almost contrition and almost grief, and not quite either. He was breathing hard. There was blood on his left hand from somewhere. He looked, for the first time in Zaid's memory, like a man who was tired. "I never wanted her," Zane said. The fury moved. Zaid held it. "I know that's not what it looked like. I know that's not..." Zane stopped, pressed his mouth shut for a moment. "I never wanted Marin. I want you to know that. What I did to her wasn't about her." "Then what?" Zaid said quietly. "Was it about?" It wasn't a question, but Zane answered it anyway. "I wanted you to look at me," he said, "the way you look at her." A silence that had weight and temperature. Just once. Zane's voice cracked on the last word, a hairline fracture in the controlled surface. "I wanted to be someone you'd tear down gates for. Someone you'd walk through snow for. Someone you'd..." He stopped again. "I wanted to matter to you the way she matters. That's all it ever was. 26 years of that. And I didn't know how to make it stop." The clearing was very quiet. Something moved in the burning gold of Zaid's eyes. Not warmth, not yet. Maybe not ever. Not in this form. But something. A flinch. The almost imperceptible shift of a man who has heard something true land in the part of him that still knows the difference between truth and everything else. The fury did not still. He did not stop. But it landed. He let it land. Filed it somewhere beneath the burning, in the part of him that was still and would always be the man who had grown up alongside this person, who had shared a face and a blood and a history that neither of them had chosen. He felt it. Then he kept walking. Zane ran, and Zaid followed, carrying the weight of what his brother had said like a stone in the chest, through the old forest, through the cold, toward whatever ending the next territory held. The monster had a conscience. He hadn't lost it. That would matter. He just didn't know it yet. Chapter 8. The border fortress had no name anymore. It had been called something once the histories referenced it in passing, a stronghold of strategic significance, a position held and lost and held again across 3 generations of conflict. But the war that ended with their father's death had ended here, and after that nobody had seen the use in naming a ruin. It stood at the edge of the 4th territory, like a sentence that had been interrupted mid-word, walls still upright on 3 sides, the 4th collapsed inward, the great hall open to the sky, snow accumulating on the floor where a throne room had once been. Zaid had never come here. He came here now. Zane was inside, had stopped running, finally, not because he'd found safety, but because there was nowhere left to go. The 4th territory ended at a cliff, faced 2 miles east. The river to the north was moving ice this time of year, uncrossable on foot. He had run out of geography. Zaid walked through the collapsed wall and into the open hall, and found his brother standing in the center of it, in the snow, under the open sky, in the place where their father had died. Neither of them spoke for a moment. The wind moved through the broken walls with a low, sustained note, not howling, just present, the sound of air passing through spaces that had once been solid. Snow fell in slow, vertical lines. The torchlight that had once lit this hall was long gone. What remained was winter moonlight, and the faint gold luminescence that the fury cast on everything within Zaid's immediate radius. Zane looked at him. He had stopped performing. Whatever composure he'd carried through the chase had finally exhausted itself, and what remained underneath was something rawer and less managed, a man at the bottom of a decision he'd made 43 days ago, standing in the consequences of it. "You're not going to say anything," Zane said. "Not a question." "No," Zaid said. "Not even..." Zane stopped, looked at the snow between them. "Not even what father would have said. Some speech about the bloodline, about what we owe each other." "No, because you've already decided." Zaid didn't answer. The answer was in the gold of his eyes, in the stillness of him, not the stillness of restraint, which had a quality of pressure, of something held back. This was the stillness of completion, of a process that had reached its final step. Zane knew it. Zaid could see the knowledge move through him, the small, involuntary settling of a body that has stopped hoping for a different outcome, "I'm not going to fight you," Zane said quietly. "I know. I want you to know that I—" A sound at the broken wall. Both of them turned. She rode through the gap in the collapsed stone like she'd been doing it her whole life. No hesitation, no slowing, the horse's hooves scattering debris across the snow-covered floor. She pulled up in the center of the hall and dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, dropping to the ground with the focused inelegance of someone who had been riding through the night and had left Grace somewhere in the third territory. She was still wearing the high-necked dress. It was ruined hem dark with mud and snow, fabric pulled wrong at the shoulder where the false mark sat beneath it, her dark hair entirely free of its arrangement. She looked like someone who had made a series of increasingly questionable decisions and had not once stopped to reconsider any of them. She looked, Zaid thought, from somewhere very deep and very still inside the burning, like the most important thing he had ever seen. Her eyes found him immediately. They always did. She crossed the space between them without looking at Zane, without acknowledging the ruins or the moonlight, or the 48 hours of hunt that had led to this hall. She walked through the snow toward him with the directness of a woman who had calculated the distance and the risk, and found both irrelevant. He didn't move. The fury was very loud. She stopped in front of him. He was taller than her by enough that she had to look up, and she did directly, without flinching, without the involuntary pullback that everyone else performed in his proximity now. That animal wisdom that said, "This is dangerous. Give it space." She looked at him the way she always had, like she was reading something she'd studied for years and still found interesting. The gold of his eyes met hers. She said his name. Not Your Majesty. Not Alpha. Not any of the titles that lived between them in public. The formal distances that court maintained like load-bearing walls. Zaid. Just that. Just his name in her voice. The way she said it in the dark of their chambers. The way she said it when it was only the two of them, and there was nothing to perform, and nothing to protect. Something in the burning flickered. She stepped closer, close enough that he could see the false mark pulsing dully through the fabric at her shoulder, cold violet, invasive, wrong, and something in him that was both the fury and the man underneath. It contracted with a fury so total, it nearly moved him. She raised her hand, placed it flat against his chest, over his heart. He looked down at her hand. Her fingers were cold from the ride. He could feel the pressure of them through the fabric, slight, deliberate, a physical sentence that said, "I know what's in here, and I am not afraid of it." "Come back," she said. The fury roared. He held it. "I need you to come back." Her voice didn't shake. He understood what that cost her. He could see the exhaustion in her face, the 26 hours of fear and riding and fighting a council and carrying a mark that didn't belong to her. She had done all of that and ridden through the night and walked into a ruin where a monster was standing, and her voice did not shake. The gold in his eyes, that burning, sourceless, ancient gold, began, for the first time in 4 days, to shift. Not extinguished, nothing so simple as extinguished, but it moved, pulled by the hand on his chest, and the name in her voice, and the 2 years of accumulated gravity between them that no ritual and no fury and no 48-hour hunt had touched. The most powerful predator in the realm went still. Not the stillness of the hunt. Not the stillness of a fire with nothing left to burn. The stillness of a man standing at the edge of himself, feeling the edge, and choosing not to cross it. His hand came up, covered hers where it rested against his chest. He exhaled slow, long, the sound of something enormous releasing pressure through a small opening. Behind them, in the snow, Zane sat down heavily and said nothing. The wind moved through the broken walls. The snow kept falling, and the monster stayed still. Chapter 9. Zane did not resist when the border guard arrived. Marin had sent for them before she wrote out the one logistical concession she'd made to practicality, before abandoning every other instruction she'd been given. 4 of Devon's men, her most trusted, given coordinates and a timeline and orders to arrive an hour after she did. She hadn't told them what they'd find. She hadn't been entirely certain herself. They came through the broken wall to find the spare sitting in the snow of the open hall, quiet and diminished, and the Alpha King standing 20 feet away with his mate's hand still pressed against his chest. The guards read the room with the trained efficiency of men who had learned to assess dangerous situations without letting their faces show that they had. They took Zane without incident. He went with them without a word, stood when they indicated he should stand, walked when they moved him toward the wall. At the threshold he stopped, turned, looked across the ruined hall at his brother. Zaid looked back. Something passed between them. Not forgiveness. It was too early and too raw, and too much had happened for anything that complete. But something. The faintest acknowledgement of a shared history that existed beneath and before, and entirely apart from everything that had occurred in the last 43 days. The look of two people who had grown up in the same skin of the world and could not entirely unknow each other, however much had broken. Then Zane turned away and walked through the wall. The ruins went quiet. She told him everything. They sat on a fallen section of the outer wall, close enough that their shoulders touched, and Maren laid it out the way she'd been rehearsing it since she left Senna's examination room plainly, completely, without softening the edges that didn't deserve to be softened. The false marks timeline, the integration risk, what happened to the bond if it completed, what the healer had said about the only mechanism that could stop it. Zaid listened without interrupting. She watched him process it in the way she'd learned to read over 2 years of proximity, the slight tension at the jaw, the quality of his stillness shifting as new information added weight to it. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that the wind moved through the broken walls twice. She said conscious integration, he said finally. Not suppression. Not suppression, Maren confirmed. The cage won't work. The pathway is too damaged. It needs the fury present and directed held, not locked. There's a meaningful difference between those things, Zaid said, that I have spent my entire life treating as identical. I know. He stood, moved a few steps away, not retreating, processing, giving himself room to think without the proximity of her affecting the quality of the thought. She watched him look at his own hands. The gold had receded from his eyes over the last hour, not gone but banked, a deep amber ember rather than the forge-bright blaze of the hunt. The fury was still present. She could feel it even from here, a warmth that had nothing to do with temperature, a low-pressure change in the air around him. He was still carrying it. It hadn't left him. He simply hadn't let it carry him. She understood, looking at him, that he didn't know that was what he was doing. I don't know how to hold it, he said quietly. I know how to lock it. I've never done anything else. I think, Maren said carefully, that you've been doing it for the last hour without noticing. He turned. She held his gaze. You've been standing in this ruin with the fury fully present since I got here. You heard me. You stopped. You let them take Zane. You sat down and listened to everything I said. She paused. That isn't suppression, Zaid. That's control. Real control. Not the cage, the other kind. He stared at her. She saw it then, the thing she had suspected was underneath the composure and the iron discipline, and 26 years of a man managing himself like a catastrophe that hadn't happened yet. She saw the fear, clear and unguarded and entirely human, more naked than anything she'd seen on his face before, more exposed than grief or fury or love. He was terrified, not of the fury, of what happened if he let himself fully be both things at once, and it still wasn't enough. I see it, she said softly. I've always seen it. He looked at her for a long moment. Something in him shifted. She could see it move through him, the way weather moves through a landscape, changing the quality of the light. He crossed back to her. Tell me what to do, he said. You already know, she said. You just need to stop treating what you are as something that needs to be survived. She didn't look away. That was the part she focused on afterward. Not the light, not the sensation, not the extraordinary physical reality of what happened in the ruins of the border fortress on a winter night with snow falling through the open roof. She focused on not looking away, on keeping her eyes on his face and her hands steady, and her breathing even, because he needed to see that she could hold this, that she would not flinch, that the full truth of him had an audience who was choosing to stay. He placed his mark in full presence, not in rage. The fury moved through him like current through wire, directed, deliberate, every channel of it bent toward a single purpose. She felt it when it made contact with the false structure Zane had left. Felt the cold violet pulse flare once, bright and desperate, and then the warmth moved through it like dawn through fog. The violet black burned away. What replaced it was silver white and warm and entirely, Unmistakably right, the rightness her body had been screaming for since the courtyard. The resolution of a cord that had been held suspended for 22 days. The snow around them turned silver. She wasn't sure how long it lasted. Long enough that when it was over, they were both on their knees in the snow, his forehead against hers, both of them breathing like they'd been running. "Still here," she said. "Still here," he confirmed. By the time they rode back through the palace gates, the Lord Steward was already in custody. Davin had moved on. Her standing orders, the documented evidence of Corvain's restricted ritual texts found in Voss's private correspondence, within hours of Zane's arrest. The council that had convened at dawn 2 days ago disbanded before sunset. The chamber locked, the 7 chairs empty. The spare was in chains in the eastern tower. The king walked through his own gates, no crown, no armor, snow still in his hair, and the court that had been holding its breath for 4 days exhaled all at once. His eyes were amber. Warm amber, the kind that appeared when he was tired, or content, or standing next to a fire that wasn't burning anything down. For the first time in his life, Zaid was not caged. He was simply present. And the difference, it turned out, was everything. Chapter 10. He recused himself on a Tuesday. A formal declaration, 3 sentences, delivered to Elder Dane in writing rather than in person, not because Zaid lacked the composure to say it aloud, but because the written form was cleaner, less subject to interpretation, less likely to be read as influenced by proximity. "I cannot render impartial judgment in the matter of Zane of the Aldrich line. I submit this case to Pack Law and the Council's full authority. I will not be present for proceedings, and will accept their determination without appeal." Dane received it, read it twice, and looked up at the guard who had delivered it with the expression of a man reassessing something he thought he'd already fully assessed. "Tell His Majesty," Dane said carefully, "that the council understands." It was, everyone agreed afterward, the most kingly thing Zaid did in the entire week that followed. The acknowledgement that his presence in that room would not be justice, it would be weight, and weight was not the same thing. And a king who understood the difference was a different kind of king than the ones who had come before. Pack Law would determine what happened to Zane. The council would deliberate without the gold-eyed shadow of the ancient fury in the room. Zaid did not ask to know the outcome until it was final. He went back to his chambers. He went back to Marin. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet after weather, a stillness that wasn't empty but settled. The particular piece of a space that had been through something and was now simply existing on the other side of it. Snow fell outside the tall windows, steady and unhurried, the kind of snowfall that had no agenda. A fire burned in the hearth. The lamps were low. Someone had brought food at some point, a tray on the side table, largely ignored, the tea gone cold. Marin sat on the window seat with her knees drawn up, watching the snow. The mark on her shoulder had settled into something silver-white and warm over the past 2 days, the wrongness entirely gone from it, replaced by a heat that was familiar and orienting in the way the bond had always been. She touched it occasionally without meaning to. Not checking, just confirming. The way you reach for something in the dark to verify it's still there. Zaid sat on the floor. Not the chair, not the edge of the bed. The floor, his back against the foot of the bed, one knee drawn up, the posture of a man who had stopped performing dignity for the evening and found the ground closer to honest. His crown was on the table across the room where he'd set it when they walked in, and he hadn't looked at it since. They had been mostly quiet for an hour. It was a comfortable quiet. She had learned early in their relationship that Zaid processed sideways, not through conversation but alongside it, filling silence with thought until the thought was finished, and then speaking. Pushing him before he was done produced nothing useful. Waiting produced everything. She waited. "I was afraid of you," he said. She turned from the window. He was looking at the fire. "Not of you specifically," he continued, with the careful precision of a man saying something he has been rehearsing in some interior room for a very long time, "of what you would do, if you saw it. The full thing." He paused. "I've managed my entire life around the assumption that if anyone saw all of it, not the controlled version, not the king, but the actual, they would make a reasonable decision and leave." Marin said nothing. Let him finish. "I structured everything around that," Zaid said. "Every decision about the fury. Every wall I built. The cage wasn't about protecting the realm." He looked at his hands. It was about protecting the version of me that you might be willing to stay with. The fire crackled. Snow pressed against the glass. I know, Marin said. He looked up. I've always known, she said. She uncurled from the window seat and crossed to him, sitting down on the floor beside him with the naturalness of someone who had long since stopped caring about the furniture hierarchy. You think you were hiding it? You weren't. You were just very disciplined about how visible you let it be. And you stayed anyway. I stayed because, she said, there's a difference. He looked at her. The amber of his eyes in the firelight was warm and deep and entirely human, no gold, no burning, just the face she had been reading for 2 years and would spend the rest of her life continuing to read. I fell in love with a man who was afraid of himself, Marin said. She held his gaze the way she'd held it in the ruins directly, without flinching, without performance. He was careful and precise, and so controlled it sometimes hurt to watch, because I could see what it cost him, and I loved that man. She paused. And then I stayed for the man who stopped being afraid. And I love him more. Zaid didn't speak. She watched him receive it, watched it move through him, the way real things move through. People who have spent too long being careful about what they let land, not deflected, not managed. Just felt, completely, in the quiet of a room with snow at the windows and a fire burning low. His jaw tightened once, released. I would have burned everything, he said. His voice was quiet. Not ashamed, just honest. If you hadn't come, if you hadn't, he stopped. I would have burned it all and felt nothing, and that's the part that... I know, she said. She reached up and took his face in both hands, the way she had in the ruins, the way she had in the courtyard, the way she would for every year that followed this one. His hands came up to cover hers immediately reflex, gravity, the same bone-deep orientation he'd always had toward her. That's why I came, she said. He closed his eyes. She felt the exhale move through him long, slow, the last of something releasing that had been held for 26 years. Not gone. Never entirely gone, but no longer carried alone. Outside, the snow kept falling. The fire kept burning. The bond between them, silver white and warm and finally, fully settled, held. Not like a lifeline anymore. Like a foundation. Like something you build a life on. Not something you grip in the dark to keep from drowning. Like home. In the Eastern Tower, Pack Law deliberated for 3 days and rendered its judgment. The palace gates are rebuilt, but Zaid has them cast in a different design. Wolves in full howl rather than wolves in chains. The elders who survived the purge of the council learn to live with a king who no longer apologizes for what he is. Zayn, sentenced to exile rather than death, disappears beyond the northern border and is not spoken of. Marin's mark shines silver white at her shoulder, permanent and luminous. Their first child is born with pale gold eyes, the ancient fury in miniature, already learning to be held rather than caged. The world did not end, the monster did not win, and a king who spent his life afraid of his own nature, finally came home to it. If this story stayed with you, if Zaid and Marin and the ruins and the silver mark and the gates torn clean off their hinges lived in your chest, even a little subscribe. It takes 2 seconds. It costs you nothing. And it means the next story finds you instead of disappearing into an algorithm that doesn't know you've been here, that doesn't know you stayed until the end, that doesn't know you felt this. I know you felt it. You wouldn't still be here if you hadn't. The subscribe button is right there. Hit it for Marin, who rode through the dark alone. Hit it for Zaid, who spent his whole life afraid of himself and loved her anyway. And leave me a comment. I read every single one. Tell me whose story you want next. Tell me which moment broke you. Tell me if you saw the twist coming or if the ruins caught you completely off guard. Because the only thing better than telling a story like this one is knowing someone was listening. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.